According to the fourth report from the GIEC, climate change is a fact, and it is indeed leading the Earth towards global warming. Since the pre-industrial era, around the 18th and the beginning of the 19th century, the Earth suffered from 1.11 degrees Celsius warming, with 0.11 degrees Celsius per decade increase since 1970. And that number is still growing. We have seen that this warming is greatly correlated with the rate increase in CO2, as there was a 40% increase of CO2 in the atmosphere from 1750 to 2015. The last 5 years have been the warmest, as the recorded temperature were higher than any temperature ever documented. This drastic warming is progressively leading towards concrete modifications such as the rise of the sea level. In parallel, since the beginning of the 20th century, the sea temperature suffered from a 0.5 degrees Celsius rise. This augmentation in temperature is also leading to consequences, namely the acidification of the oceans.
The Earth follows an alternative pattern between glacial and interglacial periods. The last period in which the Earth suffered from a similar climate change was 125,000 years ago. At that time, the temperature were on average a degree Celsius higher than today, and the sea level was 10 meters higher. Thus, the researchers are concerned about how fast the Earth warmed up, caused by human activity. Since 1993, the satellite data has informed us that the sea level is constantly rising. By looking at actual data, scientists can roughly predict that the sea level could rise between 1 and 3 meters higher than the actual level. The rise of the sea level is mainly caused by the ice melting, due to the actual climate change, but is also caused by thermal expansion.
The first factor is quite instinctive. As climate change leads the Earth towards global warming, the ice located on continents, the ice cap, for example, is progressively melting and the water finds its way towards the oceans. The thermal expansion is, thus, also an important factor in the rise of sea level. Indeed, under higher temperatures, molecules tend to take up more volume. This is how the volume that water molecules occupy expands in correlation with global warming. One can easily imagine that with such a high rise, the consequences for human activity could be drastic. Experts theorize on the fact that soon, 1 billion lives could be in danger by this consequence of global warming. More precisely, it is predicted that by 2050, 300 million people living in coastal areas could be endangered by that phenomenon.
The pH modifications are caused 60% by CO2 and 40% by water temperature. Carbon dioxide plays a huge role in the acidification of the oceans. It is true that the oceans have a natural and scientifically explained tendency to absorb the CO2 in the atmosphere. However, human activity has terribly increased the CO2 rate in the atmosphere, thus increasing the rate of this gas present in the oceans. Ocean acidification has drastic consequences on shells and skeletons, which get weaker and weaker. Indeed, the reaction between CO2 and the seawater produces ions H+, which tend to limit the reinforcement of shells and skeletons for fish. Indeed, the carbonate used to reinforce shells reacts with the liberated H+, and transforms into bicarbonate, which is no longer useful to marine wildlife like mussels, oysters, snails, urchins, and mollusks.
This already has consequences on human lives, as the fishing activity is limited by this reaction, causing perturbations in the marine food chains. If the acidification of the oceans continues, the shells will eventually decompose and could lead to species extinctions. Also, the whitening of corals, as an essential habitat for marine wildlife, sheltering more than 25% of it, is proof of the decrease in the wildlife caused by our hand.
Climate change is a complex subject which is still studied. However, we cannot procrastinate about finding a solution to this issue, as the overall causes of the rise of the sea level is global warming. We have to find human and industrial solutions to limit the human pollution and the CO2 rate increase. At this point, climate change cannot be cancelled. However, we can still narrow the destructive impact we have on our planet. Indeed, reducing the rise of the sea level by 10 cm would directly impact 10 million people.